Today we're very privileged to have Rob Stevens here, and a lot of us would already know Rob. He's been a friend of ours for a long time, and if you're going to do research in New South Wales schools, you definitely want to make him a friend of yours, because he reviews the applications, the research applications there. Now most of you would have already read Rob's bio, but just a little bit which I grabbed off the Amazon site. But you know, he has interests in biology, philosophy, ethics. Also, he initiated a long-running non-fiction book club. He's been a part of the Lotus Buds Sangha.
That's right, yes, it's a Buddhist group.
Yeah, Buddhist group, so you might want to tell us briefly about that before we get into that.
Yeah.
And also, one of the reasons why I got him here is one of our students, Rose, is doing her PhD on positive education, which is obviously of big interest to you, and I just thought it would be a good synergy and good opportunity to see what other people are doing in this space as well. So, warm welcome to Rob Stevens.
Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. And
loud voice.
Yeah, okay. And this is my first time at this building, so it's absolutely wonderful to be joining you again. And I might just explain Lotus Buds, and that is a Buddhist Sangha, or a community, and we follow the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who you might be aware of, a Zen Buddhist monk who was born in Vietnam and was strong in the protest movement against the Vietnam War. For his troubles, he was exiled to France, where he's lived ever since. So perhaps with that little introduction, I might press on with the presentation. And I suppose what I wanted to mention was that that my thinking about positive education stems from how to implement the Department of Education strategic plan, which is the most recent one, 2018 to 2022. And one of the goals of that strategic plan is that every student is known, valued and cared for in our schools. And goal 4 is, I think, a rather related one. Every student is engaged and challenged to continue to learn. And I think that one very important approach to contributing to the achievement of goals 2 and 4 is through the application of positive psychology to school education, or positive education. So that sort of sets, I suppose, the context for what I want to talk about. Okay, so first of all, what is positive psychology? And there's different ways of categorising positive psychology, and different people see it, I suppose, in different sorts of ways. Positive psychology could be categorised as a movement, a theory, a science, and to that, and I think there's a good case for looking at it in any of those ways, but I would add an empirically informed philosophical idea about the nature of well-being. And so Seligman, Martin Seligman, kind of, I suppose, the father of positive psychology, sees positive psychology as a herald of a new axial age, and I think there's something to that, a lot to that. But its roots, I think, go back to the first axial age, just over 2,300 years, to Aristotle's thinking about the nature of life and well-being. And although Seligman doesn't acknowledge those roots, I think they're very much there in his language and in the way he describes well-being. So Aristotle considered that telos, or ultimate purpose, or I suppose the Seligman would talk about meaning, of a human being is what's called eudaimonia, or flourishing, and Seligman certainly uses the word flourishing, or realising one's true nature, that is a complete human life lived at its best. And Seligman uses the term flourishing, harking back to Aristotle, or Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia. And flourishing for Aristotle, as for Seligman, involves the cultivation of strengths consolidated into character traits or virtues. And I think their views of well-being are very similar in that respect. So Seligman claims that there are 5 elements of well-being: positive emotion, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. So for Seligman, as I understand him, positive emotion involves feeling good, and it involves life satisfaction. But engagement is defined as flow, complete absorption in a task. Relationships are relationships with mainly, I think he focuses mainly on with other human beings. Meaning, a sense of belonging to and serving something you believe to be larger than self. And accomplishment, which is achievement. I think all of those actually require some careful qualification. I think I would agree with the tenor of all of that, but I think it requires some very, very careful qualification. Positive emotion, I think, is something, for instance, that requires very careful qualification. It's important to our well-being, I think, to avoid cynicism and an overly negative view about life, and to recognise its true value. But it's equally important to avoid sentimentalism, which is a Pollyanna-ish kind of view of life. And negative emotions such as anger and fear, I think, can be our friends. And anger can highlight something like an injustice. Fear can be a warning of danger. They've got really important, the negative emotions actually have really important things to teach us and tell us, and so that's something that I think is an important qualification to the idea of positive emotion. And also I think that the idea of engagement, or Seligman's idea of engagement, also requires very careful qualification. Seligman's equation of engagement and flow, I think, is too strong. A person can be engaged in what they're doing, even be fully mindful about what they're doing, without experiencing flow, which is kind of, in a sense, being lost in what we're doing. So engagement doesn't preclude planning for the future, but investing in the future too much focusing on the future and chasing after sort of big happinesses, I suppose, could disrupt a deep investment in the present. And I suppose a good way of thinking about what our attitude perhaps to time might be is to remember the past, live in the present, with the future in mind. Also, Seligman focuses on relationships with humans as an element of well-being. However, I believe it's arguable that human relationships with the broader living world is equally a component of well-being. And as sorry.
Anyone else, we would have thrown them out.
Yes. It's a good reminder.
Sorry. Yes. So as Nussbaum suggests, being able to have concern for animals, plants, and nature is one of the capabilities that's constitutive of well-being. There's a tendency in positive psychology to individualise well-being and to view well-being as self-determined. And the implication is that if you are discontented or melancholy, then you're simply not just trying hard enough. You've not put the effort in to acquire the skills that you need to be happy. So you should not blame a dysfunctional family life, inequality, discrimination, workplace exploitation, or harsh government policies for your condition. But as Aristotle recognised, man is a political animal, and human well-being depends on the justice of the arrangements within the societies in which we live. So you really need to take account of context. And we do well-being together. It's not something that we do sort of separately by entirely our own efforts. It's something that we do together as a community or in communities. But I think that the most, perhaps for me, the most important aspect of Aristotle's view of well-being, which is also picked up by Seligman, is that well-being is not so much a state, but something that we actually do, namely living well. So well-being is not so much a noun as a verb. Well-being consists in cultivating capabilities, strengths, largely personal and social capabilities, and exercising those capabilities. And I think that is a very key insight into well-being, and one that's very helpful in terms of advancing well-being in education. So the cultivation and exercise of a number of general capabilities identified by ACARA, which are part of the Australian curriculum, can be seen as actually being constitutive of well-being. And some of those capabilities, which I think are perhaps constitutive of well-being, are critical and creative thinking, personal and social capabilities, most especially, ethical understanding, very, very important, and also intercultural understanding. And perhaps one could add one also attending to what you're doing as a capability. So positive psychology, I believe, is an excellent framework for at a policy level for schools, and it's something that has deeply influenced the department's policy frameworks. So the New South Wales Department of Education Wellbeing Framework for schools is clearly informed by positive psychology. It states well-being is more than the absence of physical or psychological illness. In very broad terms, well-being can be described as quality of a person's life, and that's a quote from the Wellbeing Framework. It notes two major approaches to defining well-being: subjective experience of feeling good and functioning well, or our potential to flourish. And the best approach, according to the wellbeing framework, and also to positive psychology, and certainly Seligman, I think much of positive psychology, it combines feeling good with functioning well. And the framework recognises that we feel and function across 5 domains: cognitive, emotional, social, physical, and spiritual well-being. And cognitive relates to achievement, which is one of Seligman's components of well-being. Emotional relates to emotional regulation, which relates to positive emotion. Social well-being includes positive relationships, which is another of Seligman's components of well-being. And spiritual well-being relates to our sense of meaning and purpose. So the whole way the department shapes its understanding about well-being and its policies and how that flows through to practice is informed very deeply by positive psychology, and very appropriately too, in my view. And the department's school excellence framework, which is an accountability framework that all schools need to show how they are meeting, includes well-being as one of its learning elements. And in its characterisation of well-being is based on the well-being framework. In schools, how they characterise it is in schools that excel, there is a strategic and planned approach to support the cognitive, emotional, social, physical, and spiritual well-being of all students. So so positive psychology is very deeply entrenched in the broad policy framework, the well-being framework, and then that flows on to the school excellence framework, which is an accountability framework. And I would also mention here that positive psychology also, I think, influences whole school policies such as anti-bullying and anti-racism, which is an important aspect of well-being as well, and an important way in which well-being is cultivated in schools at that more collective kind of level. But also it informs positive behaviour for learning, which is largely a framework for schools to support the well-being of students, principally by means of fostering positive relationships, which is one very obviously very important component of well-being. So social and emotional learning. That social and emotional learning is, I think, a very important way to that schools advance the well-being of students by focusing on those general capabilities, the personal and social capabilities. And what I'm interested in, I suppose, are the kinds of pedagogies that are relevant to advancing social and emotional learning, and according to Noble and McGrath, social and emotional learning helps students to understand and manage their emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And it's and that is a central component of a program to cultivate ACARA's personal and social capabilities. And ACARA acknowledged they talk a lot about social and emotional learning in their account of the personal and social capabilities. Now, the collaborative for academic, social and emotional learning approach relies very heavily on direct instruction in cultivating personal and social capabilities. And the 2013 Castle Guide notes that traditionally most social and emotional learning programs have used explicit lessons to teach students social and emotional skills. But it's interesting that a report by Erebus found that, written in Australia, is that Castle findings from US school-based programs need to be treated with some caution if applied to other countries such as Australia. Many of the American CEL programs do not fit the Australian education context because they're highly structured, highly sequenced and manualised, which is not the Australian way of teaching. And I would, in my experience in public schools in New South Wales, and at the moment there's quite a revolution going on in terms of the way that teaching is being done away from a more explicit and direct instruction approach to a more inquiry-based approach, and project-based learning is becoming increasingly popular in certainly in New South Wales, and I think that actually plays well with social and emotional learning, and so I would suggest that. But the American approach, which and the overemphasis on explicit instruction as being the only way, doesn't fit with the approach recommended by the OECD of not relying too heavily on any one pedagogical approach. And I think that will be the approach in New South Wales as well.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's fine. No, that's fine.
Flow.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Is there evidence that this other approach that's been used here is effective?
Yes, absolutely. John Hattie has mentioned that direct instruction has an effect size of 0.65, whereas something like classroom discussion or dialogical teaching has an effect size of 0.82, which is double the suggested.
On what outcomes?
Sorry.
On what outcomes?
This is like applied generally for teaching and learning, not specific to social and emotional learning, but
mostly academic achievement.
Academic achievement.
No, but I thought we were talking about social emotional here.
Okay,
yeah.
And what I would, but I would suggest that that in terms of developing capabilities such as critical and creative thinking that the evidence would be consistent. It would be similar to the academic sort of outcomes, and perhaps I'll just go on to explain why I think, in general sorts of terms, why that's the case. Yeah, sorry.
Maybe you're going to, or maybe you can, as you present, can you tell us about some of the ways that the department is actually evaluating? I mean, some of them come across as motherhood, parenthood statements, and if they're not actually being evaluated and so forth, there's no programs that are set up. So if you could talk about some of that.
Okay.
You present.
Yeah, look, that's right. And what I'll probably do is just present it as a general kind of in a general way, defending the inquiry-based approach.
And I have no problem for presenting it as an ideal.
Yeah.
Just what I wanted to know
Yeah.
was whether there's any empirical evidence
Yeah.
of movement
Yeah.
towards that ideal and what produces those ideals.
Okay, all right. Let's see how
Sure.
it goes, and perhaps we could tunnel in a little bit more
Yeah.
as I go. But I would also, like I mean, I think there's perhaps a bit of a case for suggesting that that so personal and social, social and emotional skills are probably a little bit similar to other kinds of skills as well, and so if a inquiry-based approach is effective in cultivating the more academic skills, it perhaps might suggest that it might be useful in the social and emotional realm as well. But let's have a look and see.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
That word explicit, I'm not quite sure how they use that. I know that I'm not sure how Castle uses that. Don't think it necessarily means direct instruction.
No, okay. And that, look, the emphasis is always on combining the approaches. I mean, it shouldn't be one or the other, and that's what the OECD suggests generally for teaching and learning, that one shouldn't rely too heavily on any one form of instruction, but should use a variety of approaches. And I think that is the sensible way to go. And that's certainly the sensible way to go in terms of developing academic skills and achieving academic outcomes. And I think it's the same if you're trying to develop social and emotional learning as well. And I'll just talk perhaps though in general terms about the way in which an inquiry-based approach might be helpful in cultivating social and emotional learning. And yeah, but please jump in and kind of like what I would suggest is that a community of inquiry is a very good way for participation in a community of inquiry is a very good way of cultivating personal and social capabilities. And basically a community of inquiry involves a group of students discussing issues. It could be just about anything of interest to them. And the idea in a community of inquiry is that you listen very carefully to what the other participants are saying, and you respond to that, to those, and try and uncover each other's assumptions, I think the significant thing about that is that there are a set of protocols governing a community of inquiry that students learn actually very rapidly, and certainly in my experience, students pick up these protocols incredibly quickly. So students rapidly learn the protocols associated with participation in a face-to-face community of inquiry. Protocols such as taking it in turns to speak, not interrupting a speaker, no put-downs, building on the ideas of others. They are very rapidly ritualised and habitualised, and certainly in the cases of communities of inquiry that I've seen, that has been the case. And I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, you kind of look at these things and you think, oh, look, they could be faking this, but I think it's fake it until you make it. And they pick it up incredibly rapidly. And those habits that the kids get into in these communities of inquiry, and it doesn't have to be a community of inquiry about social and emotional learning either. It could be quite, a community of inquiry about mathematics. They lay the foundation for communicative virtues such as honesty, humility, care, empathy, civility, perspective, wisdom, and trust. And a community of inquiry embodies the idea that the children have their own ideas, questions and voices that are worth considering. They have their own wisdom that we should listen to carefully. And by respecting children's wisdom, children are encouraged to trust their own wisdom and thinking abilities. And all these are, I think, are really important messages to be getting across to kids. And I think they help, those messages actually really do help their social and emotional learning. Participation in a community of inquiry is also a useful context for developing ethical understanding. And we've had a lot of experience of that. A community of inquiry is an excellent way of discussing controversial issues in a way that complies with the department's controversial issues policy that states discussion of controversial issues in schools should allow students to explore a range of viewpoints and not advance the interest of any particular group. But I should also mention that the ethics courses that in schools as an alternative to special religious education are an example of a community of inquiry that is used to teach ethics. And again, there's been some evaluation of that kind of approach, and which, while not entirely without its problems, kind of like it has suggested that it's certainly a viable way to go. And a community of inquiry enacts, I think, also a number of departmental values relating to positive relationships. So this is something, these are all values that are in the department's strategic plan. We respect diversity and the views and contributions of others. We build relationships based on transparency, honesty and mutual respect. We support each other. We respect each other's expertise, experience and points of view, and listen with an open mind. And I think that we've got all, as a department, we have all these values, including those values. And I think that it would be unusual to say, but our teaching practice shouldn't reflect those values, kind of like, and so a community of inquiry is a great way of teaching that reflects those values. I think that that there are a number of programs, very good programs, that are based on positive psychology that complement the whole school policies that I've been talking about, and also engaging pedagogies. For example, Bounce Back is an Australian program based on Seligman's PERMA model that we've talked about. And one thing that I think would be very helpful in terms of advancing positive education is perhaps to use the values in action strengths test. and positive psychology sees well-being as living well. Living well involves cultivating and acting on personal and social capabilities or strengths. And the values in action signature strengths test is based on the identification of 24 strengths grouped under 6 virtues: wisdom and knowledge, courage, humanity and love, justice, temperance and transcendence. Now, I think it could be very beneficial for students perhaps to take the VIA strengths test. And I think it could be a very useful stimulus for a discussion in a community of inquiry. And students might discuss questions such as, what makes your life go well and why? Is well-being something we do? Is it living well? Why or why not? Are the strengths you would, are there strengths that you'd add to or remove from the VIA action, values and action list? You don't want necessarily kids to just sort of take the whole VIA strengths test at face value. You want them to engage with it in a critical way. And I think a community of inquiry is a very good way of getting students to engage with the with something like the VIA strengths test, with all its problems and difficulties perhaps. It's a community of inquiry is a good way to get students to engage with that in a critical way. Are there strengths you would add or remove from the values in action list, and why? And are some strengths more important than others, and why? So a community of inquiry, I think, is a useful context for the cultivation and practice of mindfulness as well. So successful participation in a community of inquiry involves deep listening to one another with respect, reading each other's faces, and reading each other's postures. All very important social and emotional skills. It requires also looking inwards as well, which is a very important emotional skill. What am I feeling? What are these feelings telling me? What is my posture? What's my posture telling me? What does it convey? And what are the assumptions I hold in relation to my position? Can I let go of those in response to perhaps what other people say? All very important, in my view, social and emotional learning skills. Successful participation in a community of inquiry requires, I think, mindful speech, both of self and of others, but not in a religious context or a therapeutic context, but in the context of learning. I think one needs to be a little bit careful to avoid approaches to cultivating mindfulness that are too much in a religious context or otherwise secularized beyond all meaning. And also one needs to be careful to avoid a therapeutic context, I think. And I think a community of inquiry actually avoids those kinds of contexts for learning about mindfulness. And schools can, so just by way of conclusion, I suppose, schools can foster living well, personal and social capabilities through implementing whole school programs such as the wellbeing framework and the school excellence framework, positive behaviour for learning, which focuses on positive relationships, fostering social and emotional learning through pedagogies involving community of inquiry and that should read supplemented by, not supplanted by, bad Freudian slip there, explicit teaching, and using complementary programs such as bounce back, strength identification, and mindfulness. So, thank you. Yeah.
Really interesting presentation. I'm glad you brought up the capabilities approach. I think that probably controversial here, but that's a more positive approach from the positive psychology approach. And the one thing I like about it is it's not just talking about the cultivation skills, but also a theory of justice of how those things should be distributed and what should be distributed. Should we be caring about the distribution of capabilities or functionings or conversion?
That's right.
What do you have in mind about the theory of justice that should go
Well,
on?
look, I would probably go along with Nussbaum's model of capabilities and strengths, which ties in very much with Sen's approach to, and Sen also has a capability approach to justice, and it involves justice as being allowing people to reach, everybody to reach a certain threshold of these key capabilities, and I think the kinds of capabilities that Nussbaum and Sen talk about are broadly compatible with the sorts of capabilities and strengths that say Seligman talks about. I mean, I think. Personally, I find Nussbaum's a little bit more congenial, but you know, kind of, I think there's a lot of overlap. In fact, for that matter, a lot of overlap with Aristotle's views about the virtues. But as I mentioned, also Aristotle believed that you know that we are political animals, that we live in a society, and you know, like and justice is a very aspect of that. But I guess, like, my own view of justice would be along the lines of Sen's and Nussbaum's, and the capability approach, and making sure that people are able to reach certain thresholds in terms of capabilities that they need for well-being.
So does that mean from that, sorry?
Yeah, no.
So from a policy perspective, then that would imply we should be devoting as many resources as possible to those below the threshold.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
fixing that before we deal with the distribution of one.
Yeah, I would certainly support that. Although I mean, the kinds of programs that I've been talking about are universal programs. However, I think they are incredibly effective for students with low socioeconomic background, and they've been sort of the communities of inquiry have been used quite extensively for people in low socioeconomic background to quite good effect, I think.
Rob, yeah, there wouldn't be anyone here who disagrees with a positive psychology approach, and if they are, they're probably not in the right place. But how do you go about introducing positive psychology education, whatever you want to call it, in those schools that are, you know, below SES? There's problems with attendance, there's behavioural problems, there's you've got bad influences outside the school that flow into the school, so you know they're really struggling. Where do you start?
Well,
the question makes sense?
I mean, it does. And, you know, like I think, first of all, school excellence program is, you know, like, sorry, the school wellbeing framework is a good general place to start. School excellence framework, flowing into that is kind of the next level. Then, I mean, positive behaviour for learning is really very important in terms of introducing, like, setting expectations, I suppose, around like one's rights and responsibilities, and the kind of behaviour that's expected, and the kinds of relationships that are expected, and then I think the the whole school kinds of programs like the anti-racism policies and anti-bullying is really very, very important. And then I think that in terms of again developing those personal and social capabilities, some form of community of inquiry is some form of pedagogies of community inquiry are also very helpful. And I mean, I just think that just reflecting on sort of schools where I think they've introduced these kind of programs very well, are ones where the school sets very, very clear behavioural expectations, and that can be done via a variety of policies, such as an anti-racism framework, or a well-implemented anti-racism or anti-bullying type of framework, but also like whole school initiatives. I'm just reflecting back on an interview that I did with a young Aboriginal man doing his HSC at a school serving one of the lowest socioeconomic communities in Australia, in southwestern Sydney. And we asked him what would the school do if what would happen if you experienced a racist incident. What would the school do? And the student sort of scratched his head and he couldn't think of a racist incident having occurred at that school. And he was in the HSC, an Aboriginal boy in the HSC, never having experienced a racist incident. And I think that and that was largely because of those broader kind of sort of anti-racist policies at the school, and setting very clear expectations about behaviour and relationships and positive relationships. And that, I think, flowed down to the whole culture of the school. The whole culture of the school was very positive and emphasised positive relationships. And I think those sort of and I think also the pedagogies were also very, in some sense, quite involved to some degree communities of inquiry. And I think that all helped to set the culture in the school that was incredibly helpful to students from historically marginalised backgrounds. And I think that probably, my experience tells me that from other schools as well, that is also the case. That's the case. I don't know whether that answers your question.
No, thanks, Rob.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
One of the things that we struggle in here is what does well-being mean, and there's probably 3 or 4 quite different approaches that we've taken. And probably any time we've had a seminar where somebody comes up with an approach that pretty much gets shot down by critics from a different perspective. And so we're struggling with this well-being actually have a meaning. Is it can you get a list of characteristics that are well-being or not well-being? And if you don't do that, then where does the empirical approach that we're wanting to have underlying the positive psychology movement, where is that? So those are some of the things that we're struggling with here.
Yes.
And certainly the list of components that you've mentioned and the diversity of issues, these are things that we've gone with. But
yeah, of course, yes, that's right. Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, how is it that how is the department approaching this issue of assessing some of these characteristics and so forth?
Well, assessing the elements
assessing
that will be
some of the elements that underpin some of the framework policy that you've talked about.
Yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, we certainly wouldn't have any formal assessments of that, at least as far as I'm aware. But teachers would perhaps assess it, you could potentially assess these, say, the personal and social capabilities, using something like maybe the solo framework, which is what you could measure is like a lot of these capabilities are capabilities in perhaps could be arguably capabilities in reasoning and giving reasons for doing things and for giving reasons for valuing things. And one could evaluate those or assess those reasons in terms of something like a solo framework, which involves a measure of the complexity with which you bring reasons to bear in making, in this case, making decisions. The lower levels of the solo framework would involve just giving one reason for something. The higher level would involve giving many reasons. The next level would involve giving integrated reasons, and then the higher level again would involve extending those reasons. And this could apply to practical reasoning, which I think is a very important part of those social and emotional skills. And I think you could have scope for measuring the way in which students integrate their reasonings, and their reasons might involve looking inside and sort of seeing what their emotions tell them. It might involve looking outside and from feedback from others and looking at the effects of others, now I can't say for sure that the department sort of uses that approach, but it would be certainly we certainly use this the solo framework and in academic sort of contexts and it would be, I think, highly applicable to social and emotional learning.
Marcus had a question up there.
You may have just partially answered my question. You didn't speak about previously positive behaviour outside of religious education. Yet we know that religious education, students can take that as an HSC subject. I was just wondering whether the department was considering what they already have a philosophy-based subject which will touch upon this?
It's something that I must admit I've been advocating for a long time myself, but so far without success. I mean, every other state in Australia has one, and they have philosophy and psychology, kind of like, and but I think in New South Wales it's kind of a badge of honour that we don't, and it's very hard. It's very hard to say. Look, all the other states have that. Kind of like, so why don't we? But when they regard it as a badge of honour that they don't, and that they see themselves as being above the other states, kind of like it's very hard to advance it. But I think it will come. And certainly I think that given the popularity of philosophy and psychology at university, that it should also be should be something that's taught in schools, and that it would have benefits in terms of cultivating those general and the general capabilities as well, particularly critical and creative thinking, but also, I believe, depending how it's taught, the personal and social capabilities as well.
That was a very rich and broad presentation, thank you. I feel as if we needed much longer. But anyway, you began with a critique of Marty Seligman's work, and I absolutely agree with what you said, but I think we let him off lightly.
Police, you won't.
I have enormous respect for what he's done in positive psychology.
Yeah.
But, for example, PERMA came out of nowhere. I mean, it's not based on anything systematic.
No.
It's just a bit random. First he had 3, now he's got 5 because his wife told him to add 1, and his students told him to add 1. But it's more important, I think, if we look at positive relationships within PERMA. It's almost entirely what we get from others.
Yes.
And when the PERMA profiler was being developed, it turned out there were not 5 factors, the 5 PERMA factors, there were 6. And the 6th factor is what we do for others or what we give others. But it was decided not to use that. So I think that's something very important to think about. That I'm sure you would agree that positive relationships is not just what we get; it's a reciprocal.
Yes, that's right. I certainly.
And indeed, the evidence is that what we do for others actually boosts our well-being more than what we get.
That's right. Yes, that's. Look, I couldn't agree more, and that probably add to my list. But I guess relationships are important, but but I agree with you that it's the giving as well as the receiving that's
even more than.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Can I just add a couple of other things? So you mentioned a few things that you would advocate, like bounce back, value, virtues in action, mindfulness. I don't think they're at the same level. Because the way I've been thinking and writing and studying mindfulness, it's actually foundational to all the others. Because, I mean, what could be more foundational than awareness?
Sure.
Training in attention, training in self-regulation.
Couldn't agree more.
So the mindfulness is foundational to all those other things.
Yeah.
And it links also to Anthony's question, because, for example, there's a school on the south coast in New South Wales, just blocking on the name of it, but it's a school for kids who've been excluded from other schools, and it's the next step before going to prison.
Sure.
And in that school, they have done a whole school approach with every teacher being trained in the .B mindfulness program.
Right.
And by all accounts, the results are extraordinary.
Okay.
The way in which these kids have turned around. So I think it's a really important foundation. And can I also ask you one other question? Sorry to take so long. But when I was reading those, the framework, the guidelines, tell me if I'm wrong, but it struck me that there's nothing in there about the well-being of teachers. And don't we need to have teacher well-being in order
That's true. Look, I think you're right, and I'm not sure yet. And certainly at the beginnings of that whole thing, I mean, of the whole well-being framework, it was supposed to be teachers as well. But I'm not sure that the way it all fell out, that teachers were included, but certainly they should be. And I think that, you know, if teachers are not well, as it were, kind of like, then their students aren't going to be either, you know, kind of like that. And so I would entirely agree with you,
and maybe school principals as well.
yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yes, that's right. Yes, that's true.
Is that something that can be introduced?
Yeah, and well, like, look, I think that I guess it's sort of part of that cultivating a positive culture in schools, and that benefits teachers as well as students, and
But how do you do that? That's the
yeah.
question. And it's so, wouldn't you think it's really important to start with teacher wellbeing, even during teacher training?
Sure. Look, I would agree that's very important. But I guess I would also see the setting those expectations around behaviour of both teachers and students as being a very important component of wellbeing in schools. And in those schools where I think they do that incredibly well, they do. Both students and teachers seem to flourish. But I wouldn't say that it's not important. Also at the level of in teacher training as well. Yeah.
Last question.
I would say, it came across in your presentation that so in the capabilities approach, they have a really strong idea of what education is for. Mm-hmm. So, Nussbaum, Brickhouse and those always talk about education is for cultivating citizens. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that at least 10 years ago that the focus of education, because of skill-based technology change and whatever, was all about human capital. Are we seeing a movement now that the New South Wales Department of Education is really focused on seeing education as being about creating citizens? Or is it still very much about human capital?
If you look at the goals of the department in the strategic plan, well, there were two I mentioned there that related very much about the well-being of students and the engagement of students. So certainly that's seen as being a very important goal of education. There are some goals that relate to kind of human capital, but one goal that has come up is that students have deep content knowledge. And I think that's a very, very interesting sort of account. And it's a little bit of a contrast to the general capabilities, for instance, and that I believe, actually going back to philosophy, deep content knowledge I think is philosophical knowledge, and philosophical knowledge I think can be gained very effectively through some form of community inquiry, and so. But it's interesting that deep content knowledge is something that is appearing in our strategic goals, and I'm very it's certainly that has heartened me considerably, and I think it's perhaps a little bit of a shift away from the sort of the more human capital kind of approach. That's perhaps the way I read it anyway. Yeah.
Okay. That's it. Thank you very much, Rob.